Hi to everybody. It really gives me a great pleasure to actually welcome you all to this evening, to our wonderful new webinar that we're having with a very special guest from Chicago, Jacqueline Kott-Wolle. And for those of you who don't know me, although I see a lot of familiar faces and names in the audience, my name is Heather Blumenthal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. Born and raised in Toronto, Canada, Jacqueline Kott-Wolle has always enjoyed creative pursuits. She has a master's in social work with a specialization in community development and social planning. However, Jacqueline has managed to incorporate the arts in almost every professional position she has held. As the former executive director of Mazon Canada, the Jewish Response to Hunger, she planned community art exhibits, original poster contests for students, and engaged the work of local artists for fundraising purposes. In 2005, after moving to Chicago with her family, Jacqueline fulfilled a long-time goal of developing her ability to paint by studying at the Art Center of Highland Park. Using a fresh palette of color, Jacqueline currently paints in oils and focuses on capturing precious moments with her family and friends. In her most recent project, and the theme of tonight's webinar, Growing Up Jewish, Art and Storytelling, is a series of 35 contemporary oil paintings and personal narratives exploring her North American brand of Jewish identity and how it evolved through 5 generations of her family. As a second-generation survivor, Jacqueline has exhibited her work in both group and solo exhibitions and lectures frequently for many organizations, most notably the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, and Momentum Boost's Yom HaShoah commemoration. Jacqueline's works are in private collections throughout the United States, Canada, and Israel. But before we begin, a few housekeeping rules. Our team will switch off your cameras and everyone will be muted. We will have a question and answer section at the end of the lecture, so be sure to type your questions either in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jacqueline.
Heather, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I want to just tell you what an unbelievable honor it is to be speaking for the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. I have to say, I am a huge lover of the South African Jewish community. I feel a real kinship. I call myself an honorary member, actually. Most of my dear friends here in Highland Park and many in my hometown of Toronto originated from South Africa. And I've spent many holidays and Shabbat dinners in their homes because we have the same thing in common. We're not living with our parents around here. So we do Jewish together, and it just feels really familiar and wonderful. And you'll also forgive me if I talk South African. Most people know that when I greet them, I say, "Yebo, how's it?" So forgive me, that's just gonna be a fun part of how I feel affection and love for this community. And I hope to come and meet you all in person at some point. So what I'm gonna do, actually, let's just share my screen. And I'm gonna take you into my presentation. Just bear with me for a moment here. Over, present. Okay, and here we go. All righty, so let's begin. I want to make sure everybody's on mute before we get started. And here it is. Okay, what I'm going to show you today is a deeply personal series. Hold on one second. I just want to make sure that we're all muted so that, can everyone hear me and we're good? Okay, good. So what I'm going to show you today is a deeply personal series of paintings and stories I created to simply look at who and what shaped my North American brand of Jewish identity. This series is called Growing Up Jewish, Art and Storytelling. I created it because I wanted to tell my family's North American Jewish story and perhaps shine a fresh new light on what Judaic art could look like. I'm going to to start my presentation today by telling you a little bit about me and how I became inspired to create this series and how I ultimately found myself very unexpectedly and unintentionally in the role of uncovering, honoring, and sharing my family's Holocaust story through really all 35 of these paintings and stories that are based on 5 generations worth of vintage family photos. I'd also like you to think about this as I do my presentation. I want you to compare the South African Jewish experience and see where we share similar histories and where we're different, and maybe we can focus on that at the end of my presentation. So do keep that in mind while I go through this presentation. So let's go on to slide 2. A little bit about me. First, let's talk about my life as an artist. It was obvious from an early age. In fact, every single report card I received from Owen Public School in Toronto, where I grew up, said the same thing year after year. Jackie talks too much and she's good at art. As for my Jewish upbringing, I'll tell you this. In our comfortable Jewish-ish Toronto neighborhood, we were considered the big Jews. My parents survived the Holocaust as children and spoke Yiddish when they didn't want us to understand something. They were the founding members of our conservative movement synagogue, which we attended every week. We kept Shabbat, we kept kosher, and we observed all the holidays. I liked it, mostly. I remember when I was in middle school, I was so embarrassed to be the only family with a sukkah in our backyard on display for all to see. We lived in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, but nobody built them. I thought it was way too Jewish, and I just wanted to be normal Jewish. It only recently occurred to me that the Jewish life we observed was informed in large part by the traditional brand of Judaism my parents brought with them from the old country after they immigrated to Canada in 1949. We were one of the only greener families in our neighborhood, which was largely populated by Canadian Jews, people whose families who have been in Canada for generations already. I will be exploring this idea a little bit more later on in the presentation. Today, not much has changed about me. I still talk a lot. I paint almost every day, and now in our comfortable Jewish-ish suburb of Highland Park, Illinois, we are considered the big Jews, at least by some anyway, which is funny to me. It's full circle. So given my connection and my involvement in my Jewish community, I've often been asked, Jackie, why don't you paint Jewish art? It was a good and logical question, but I honestly had no idea what I'd even paint. I paint figures in bathing suits. I like to draw inspiration from vintage family photos taken in summer by pools and at the beach, and then turn them into paintings. Judaism and art were 2 places where I felt very connected, but these were separate loves. Frankly, I resisted the thought of creating Judaic-themed art, and this is mostly because I had some strong associations about what I thought Jewish art should look like, based on the Jewish-themed paintings that hung on the walls in my family home. Like this guy. This man, this Hasidic rabbi, presided over many episodes of The Love Boat and Fantasy Island in the TV room of my childhood home. To me, Jewish art fell into one of 2 categories. There were either limestone-hued scenes from Jerusalem or stern-faced, bearded rabbis of old, and there was no real connection here for me. To begin with, my conservative movement rabbi had no beard and he wore turtlenecks. I had never seen a painting of Jewish summer camp, but that was where most of my important formative Jewish experiences occurred. There was a strong disconnect for me between the Judaism myself framed in paintings on the walls and my lived experiences on the ground. But the question vexed me. I wanted to challenge myself to figure out how I could create Judaic art in a way that felt truly authentic to the Judaism I grew up with. And then one day I was at my parents' house, going through their old photos, mining for something to paint, and I found a 1970s photo of my conservative movement rabbi, and then I found a lovely 1960s image of a Seder at my grandparents' house. I had a flash of inspiration. What if I paint these? Well, 2 years later, I launched an exhibit entitled Growing Up Jewish, Art and Storytelling. Based on 5 generations worth of vintage family photos, I was able to create 35 oil paintings and short narratives to tell my family's Jewish story. As I take you on this journey with me tonight, I very much want you to come away from this presentation seeing the fullness of Jewish life. Much like the famous verse from the Fiddler on the Roof song, Sunrise, Sunset, Jewish life is laden with happiness and tears. As such, you will see that many of the paintings in the Growing Up Jewish series are playful recollections of the Judaism from my youth. A great many of these paintings, however, will address my family's experiences during the Holocaust and its aftermath, and how these stories shaped my Jewish decisions both consciously and unconsciously. As I created this series, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what it meant for me to grow up in the shadow of the Holocaust as a member of the second generation. In all, I hope to give you a snapshot of North American Jewish life through 5 generations of one family that was devastated by the events of the Holocaust, that started over in Canada and rebuilt themselves and found their place in North America's vibrant Jewish communities. So I'm going to give you some context. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the second generation, a 2G. Both of my parents and their siblings, my grandparents, and a fair amount of my extended family lived through the horror of the Holocaust. My father hid in a forest with his family for 19 months. It was a terrible ordeal, during which time my great-grandmother froze to death. It's a tiny detail, but my dad recounted in his memoir that she was wearing a red and white polka-dotted dress. My mother's family was in the Krakow ghetto, narrowly escaping certain death and Nazi firing squads by using false passports to survive. My mother's extended family was interned at Auschwitz, and some of them were saved by Oskar Schindler. All of my great-grandparents perished at the hands of the Nazis. For me, the generation that survived the Holocaust existed in living color, in their printed sundresses, socks, and sandals, with numbers tattooed on their arms. I grew up amongst people who were broken and haunted by their past, but who still managed to summon great love for my generation and indescribable gratitude for Canada, where they emigrated, and the triumph that my sisters, cousins, and I represented. These people were characters with huge personalities. Some were gentle and optimistic, some were hilarious, some were strong-willed, while others appeared to always live at the edge of anger or close to tears. All of them were permanently scarred to varying degrees by living in towns and cities where their neighbors and government turned their backs on them, betrayed them, persecuted and murdered their parents, friends, and community, all for the crime of being born Jewish. Let me take you into a slideshow. Let's get this going here. I think it's sputtering. Okay, press play. Okay, so when I created this series, my interest was to look at Jewish identity as it evolved in North America. Truth be told, I deliberately tried to avoid the Holocaust when I started making these paintings. I wanted this series to be completely relatable, no matter where anyone came from in the arc of the North American Jewish story. But every time I worked on a new image, whether it was my sister Caroline singing the 4 questions at Passover, or my parents' first trip to Israel, or my daughter's bat mitzvah celebration, my mind kept drifting back to the miracle of it all. None of us should be here. Hitler and the Nazis wanted my family and all of our future generations to be gone from the face of the earth. My Auntie Sylvia always used to say, "We are survivors." I never understood why she included me in that statement until now. As I created this painting series, I realized that my art provided a powerful vehicle to honor the memory of my family members who were murdered and whose lives were never spoken of again, and to tell the survival and rebuilding stories of my parents, grandparents, and extended family members. For example, nobody really knew or remembered Usher's story of how he survived a bicycle chain beating while protecting his brother. I only remembered him as the quiet, broken uncle who came alone to all of our birthday parties. As a member of the second generation, we are truly a unique subset of the Jewish community. We straddle 2 worlds. We were used to living in the homes where there were no old family photos. We were equally comfortable in the homes of Greeners, where broken English was spoken in thick accents and expectations were high. Sometimes these homes felt really heavy and sad, especially if the survivors had whole lives before the war, including spouses and children who were taken from them. In Canada, these families were on round two, starting over with replacement spouses and replacement children who felt the enormous burden of trying to make highly traumatized parents feel whole again. People who weren't necessarily compatible because of age differences, former social standing in the old country, or religious observance levels, married out of practical necessity or pure loneliness. We understood that too. It wasn't all dark though. My parents were so in love with each other and they appreciated how much they had achieved in Canada. Our home felt pretty free and fun. But we were used to seeing numbers tattooed on the soft skin of the arms that hugged us. We were loved beyond measure and knew that in their eyes, we were considered precious walking miracles on earth. There's nothing quite like the victory look a survivor gazes at his or her grandchild. Likewise, we loved visiting the seemingly carefree modern homes of our friends whose parents were born in North America and did things that were inconceivable to us, like eating everything on the menu at Chinese restaurants or going on family ski trips. When we were growing up, ripped jeans were in style, just like now, and I remember my Holocaust survivor relatives were nervous when we wore them. They worried that we had fallen on hard times again. As loved as we were, there were unspoken rules. Those of us who are 2Gs understood that our parents' generation had been through enough, and our job was to make sure that we did not disappoint them. All they wanted from us was Yiddish nachas, pride and joy. Of course, Yiddish nachas meant different things in different households. In some homes, it simply meant that all we had to do was walk in the room. In others, it meant that we should play the violin, go to law school, at least, go to shul, keep kosher, marry someone whose parents are greeners, and don't name your babies without talking to us first, and don't get divorced, and on and on and on. It was the least we could do. As I reflected on my family, I marveled at them. I knew their stories of survival. It was the years following the Holocaust that really caught my attention. There were so many obstacles to overcome when they immigrated to Canada in 1949. How did these people arrive in North America with nothing, having endured the worst, and then manage to keep going and make a new life? Who was able to pull it off and what motivated them? Who wasn't? And what was the role of optimism in the rebuilding process? Was opportunity shared equally in these families? Who sacrificed so that others could advance? And what resentments did those left behind harbor inside of them? For many relatives like my Zadie, the prime years of their lives happened during the Holocaust. By the time Zadie arrived in Canada, it was clear to him that real opportunity was reserved for younger generations and not himself. He had to accept the fact that his small schmata business was never going to amount to much. I also wondered, what was it like to reunite with family members who were safe in Canada during the war and who knew nothing of the suffering? Were these happy reunions or were they awkward? Survivor's guilt was rampant all around, not to mention the fact that families are complicated. I know that in mine, these reunions sparked the kind of anger that generated a lifetime of broigus, which is Yiddish for holding a grudge. It had something to do with my dad having to sweep the floors of our Canadian cousin's dress factory. Imagine the pride my survivor grandparents, who came from a village that looked like Anatevka, felt when my dad graduated from law school. Being snubbed by Canadian cousins really got under their skin. How did the existing Jewish community prepare to help these people whose material and emotional needs were so profound and overwhelming? From what I understood, the Canadian Jews were quite adept at providing for the material needs of the refugees, but socially and emotionally, there was a huge divide. Neither side wanted to talk about the horrors. This was not a generation that was used to talking about their feelings. The survivors created communities of their own, sticking together at local parks on their days off from work in the garment factories, hoping to find landsmen and grateful to be in the company of people who wordlessly understood them. Every success was monumental. What could be better than passing the high school matriculation exams and then getting a degree after virtually missing a lifetime of education during the war years and time spent in the DP camps? How victorious was it to host the Pesach Seder and hear the Canadian grandchildren read the 4 questions at a large family gathering? Think about the satisfaction of being able to volunteer and give financial donations back to the community that supported them and gave them outfits to wear from a clothing bank. Can you imagine these people earning enough money to give tzedakah and spend winters in modest apartments in Florida or go on a vacation in the Catskills? Imagine how powerful it was for these people to visit the modern state of Israel, a place that might have saved so many if it had existed only 10 years earlier in the 1930s. That must have been very difficult for that generation to reconcile. You probably noted in this slideshow that there are images of Jewish life as observed by my generation and my children's generation, albeit somewhat different from the Judaism of the old country. Remember what Auntie Sylvia said? We, the 2nd and 3rd generations, are survivors too. I thought it was important to note that despite everything, the Jewish people continue. Am Yisrael Chai. As I painted these paintings and wrote these stories, I truly felt the awesome responsibility to make sure that my family's Holocaust stories, the ones that were so close to being relegated to the dustbins of history, were uncovered, recorded, and told. I am so grateful to my dad for writing his memoir before he passed away, and my mom for recounting these Holocaust and Jewish stories for me. Okay, so I'm going to take you to the next part of this presentation. Whoops, let me go back one. Okay, so we're going to go into the next part of the presentation. What I'm going to do now is focus in on a few of the paintings and read their accompanying narratives to you. Here you will see the early integration experiences of my family and what it was like to find their place within the established Jewish community. In these next few paintings and stories, I wanted to explore the social divide that existed between the Canadian Jews and the newly arrived refugees. In this slide, you'll see a painting on the right by Fairfield Porter, who is an artist that I am inspired by. And on the left is a painting I created entitled Greeners, Gaylors, and Fairfield Porter. And it's based off of a photo that was taken in 1950. Here's the story. I am most enamored with the paintings of Fairfield Porter. He was a Kennedy-era American artist who painted my fantasy of the good life. Genteel people of a certain lineage, enjoying summer moments at his family's historic beach house in Maine. Awash in color, Porter captured images of generations reading together on the screened porch, friends gathered in conversation on sun-washed Adirondack chairs, morning tennis matches in preppy whites. As much as I idealize this world, I know that my people did not come from that stock or live like that. My mother-in-law once explained to me the Jewish social hierarchy as she experienced it. There were greeners and gaylors. She was a greener. I came from greeners. Gaylor is Yiddish for yellow, and greener, well, that's obvious. These terms are used as immigration and lineage metaphors. She explained that a gaylor is like a yellow vegetable that has had time to ripen on the vine, while a greener, like a green vegetable, is new on the vine. If you're a greener, it means that you're an immigrant from the old country and you have an accent. A gaylor is someone whose ancestors have been living in the New World for generations. Gaylors have ripened on the vine of America for a long time. Stereotypically, gaylors have had time to build their fortunes in America, become genteel, and take their place as part of the leisure class. They might sail or have beach homes. They play tennis. I love this image of my husband's grandparents. There they are, 2 greeners, as if planted into a Fairfield Porter painting, but just on the other side of the fence. It was a moment captured only a few short years after escaping the ravages of war. I love that they figured out how to insert themselves, if not in, then beside the leisure class of the gaylors. They cast off their heavy clothes and the baggage of the past and had their day in the sun. This next painting explores the early reunions of families after the Holocaust. Here's how this story went down. Oi. This painting is called Usher Had High Hopes, and it's based off of a photo that was taken in 1970. Here's the story. Usher was my father's uncle. He never married or had children. In 1949, after surviving the Holocaust, Usher arrived in Canada with my grandfather, my dad, and my Aunt Sylvia. The four of them were sponsored and taken in by their brother Avroom, who had moved to Montreal in 1929. Avroom was fortunate. He was safe in Canada when the Nazis came to power, and he became financially well off by opening a dress factory. When the three siblings reunited, it was awkward, to say the least. Two brothers suffered greatly during the Holocaust, while the other was comfortable enough to buy a new Pontiac. Usher felt personally insulted when my dad, only 16 years old, was handed a broom on his first day in Canada and told to sweep the floors of the dress factory. Actually, Usher was livid, and it marked the beginning of a lifetime of broigus, which is Yiddish for holding a grudge with that side of the family. In my father's memoir, he describes that moment. Quote, "This outburst of indignation at his brother was like an opening scene in a play by Tennessee Williams. Usher must have figured out that there was not going to be manna falling from the sky, and sweeping his brother's floors was the proverbial last straw that shattered his dream of how it would be. The next day, we moved into a nice second-story flat on Jean Mann Street at the northwest corner of St. Viator," unquote. One can only imagine the pride Usher must have felt on the day my father graduated law school. Usher died in 1972. He had terrible scars on his body from the time when the Ukrainian police, at the direction of the Nazis, beat him with a bicycle chain. This painting is really new. In fact, it's still drying. And it's called Cheder in the DP camp. And it's based off of a photo that was taken in about 1948. I wanted to show this painting because at 15, this was my dad's first real experience with education. In his memoir, he explains that in all, he had 2 years of formal education in his youth. He had completed the equivalent of first grade before the war, during which time he and his family fled to the forest to hide for 19 months. When the war ended and they were in Russia, my dad had to work to help the family stay afloat. It was only when his family arrived in the DP camp in Poland that he finally had 1 year of education. My dad was 16 when he finished 7th grade in 1949. The war and post-war years in Europe had robbed him of his entire youth. He never had a bar mitzvah, nor did he receive an education. This painting is based off of a photo that I used to study as a child. When I was growing up, I had some understanding of the Holocaust, but I couldn't figure out why all those kids looked so old. There's my father in the front row. He was so eager to learn, and he told me that he loved that 1 year he had in school. Remember my report cards? The ones where my teacher said that I talked too much? I think he would tell me this to inspire me to take my studies more seriously. As I painted the faces of these 14 and 15-year-olds, I couldn't help but compare them to my own child, who is 14 today. These children struck me as so haunted and so profoundly exhausted. I wondered what they had witnessed and who they had lost. Who looked after them? Did they rebuild? How did life turn out for these children? When my dad graduated law school and was called to the bar in 1960, one of the senior lawyers at the firm where he articled remarked, quote, "It's a long way from the forests of Poland to the halls of Osgoode Hall Law School," unquote. So in my father's memoir, he recounts the challenging path he got himself on shortly after he arrived in Montreal at the age of 16. He was so determined to going from being a refugee to being as somebody, as he described it, he was so determined to go from being a refugee to being, as he described it, a somebody, and get a degree. After almost an entire lifetime without a formal education, there were a few key players in the background who showed immeasurable kindness and sacrificed for him to reach his near impossible goals. Here are their stories. Let's start with the painting on the right. It's called Nobody Asked Auntie Sylvia, and it's based off of a photo that was taken in 1977. Here's the story that goes with this painting. Have you ever wondered about the unsung heroes of your life? The people whose efforts and quiet sacrifices are at the heart of your success and maybe even responsible for your very existence? For me, that person is my Auntie Sylvia. When my dad and his sister Sylvia were small children, she saved my father's life by feeding him bits of ice to keep him alive while they were hiding in the forest during the Holocaust. Zadie and Usher had gone to get food from a righteous Gentile, and my dad and Sylvia, only 9 and 10 years old respectively, were left alone for 24 hours as they waited patiently for their father and uncle to come back. Poor Auntie Sylvia, she was cold, hungry, and terrified as she watched her little brother grow weaker and weaker in her arms. Sylvia did all she could to soothe him and make sure he had tiny drops of water in his body to sustain him. Luckily, Zadie and Usher returned before it was too late, and they nursed my father back to health. After the war, when the family arrived in Canada, Zadie and Usher were pretty clear about the role teenage Sylvia would have in the family. My grandfather and his brother weren't exactly reading early feminist writings when they immigrated. Nobody asked Auntie Sylvia if she would enjoy or benefit from a higher education. That privilege was reserved for my father. Sylvia was relegated to the kitchen to cook and clean for the men and work in the garment factory to help pay for my dad's tuition at Sir George William College while he and my mom read poetry and ate picnics at the campus quad. Sylvia passed away recently in March at the age of 89. She was amazing. Sylvia gave her all to everyone in her life. After the war, she searched for and found long-lost family in Israel. And she and my uncle were leaders at their local synagogue, and she raised 5 brilliant and interesting children. I hope I asked her everything I wanted to ask. So now I'm going to direct you to the painting on the left. And I want to emphasize here that this image of my father's graduation from university was taken only 8 short years after that year of Cheder at the DP camp. Here's the story that goes with the painting, which is called A Victory for Bernie, Sylvia, Zadie, Usher, and Muriel. And it's based off of a photo that was taken in 1956. Here's the story. When my family immigrated to Canada in 1949 after the Holocaust, there were so many obstacles to overcome. Every success was monumental. What could be better than passing the high school matriculation exams and then getting a degree and attending law school after virtually missing a lifetime of education during the war years and time spent in the DP camps? When my dad graduated from Sir George William University, now Concordia, it wasn't just for him. There were so many people who were invested in this achievement, especially those who hid in the forest with him for 19 months during the war. But the person who really deserves a special mention was its special English teacher named Miss Mitchell. Shortly after my dad immigrated to Canada and was learning to speak English, he happened upon a tutor who was helping a boy who lived in his flat. Miss Mitchell wasn't wanting to take on any more students, but she saw something special in my dad and decided to help him get ready to take the grade 11 matriculation exams. Realizing that he was a refugee and funds were tight, she refused to take her full pay. Here is how my father honored Miss Mitchell in his memoir. Quote, in late summer 1953, I learned Miss Mitchell was not well and that she couldn't continue tutoring and guiding me anymore. I soon wrote some 7 or 8 exams and passed. I was admitted to Sir George William University and I personally wanted to tell Miss Mitchell. I found out that she was now at the Royal Victoria Hospital. When I came there, her brother told me she was dying of cancer and that the diagnosis was the reason for her relatively early retirement. I was allowed to see her. She was alert and I told her the good news. I gave her my hand and she squeezed it hard. She died a week later. Amazing how she did not let on all those months that she tutored me. The vehicle of this lady's generosity carried me through the roughest terrain on my journey to where I wanted to go. So as I painted these paintings and interviewed my mom, I learned a lot about the 2 sides of the Jewish community. There was the world of the newly arrived refugees, as seen on the painting on the left, and that of the Canadian Jews. These 2 paintings speak to that divide. I'm now going to read the story that goes with the painting on the right, entitled 1950 Ladies Auxiliary Tea for the United Jewish Welfare Fund. Here's the story. When my parents immigrated to Montreal after the Holocaust, they, like so many survivors, were absorbed by the established Jewish community. I never really thought about the task of welcoming thousands of refugees, many, if not most of whom arrived in Canada traumatized by the events of the Second World War. How did the established Jewish community prepare to help these people whose needs were so profound? I have nothing but gratitude for the types of women, like those pictured here, who came together to fundraise, collect material donations, volunteer at clothing banks, and provide scholarships to young refugees who couldn't afford tuition for Jewish summer camps and schools. I am certain that in the early 1950s, my family benefited from these efforts and generosity. In many ways, however, Montreal's Jewish community, like so many established Jewish communities in North America, was strained by the sudden influx of Jews from the old country. While united by a common code of religious practice and customs, these Jews couldn't have been more different from each other. It was nearly impossible for the survivors to talk about the horrors inflicted by the Nazis. And frankly, the established community was not all that interested in hearing about it, at least not back then. It was beyond overwhelming for both sides. Furthermore, the arrival of the refugees altered the landscape of the established Jewish community and thus brought a sense of insecurity for them. Would the very presence of these immigrants threaten the equilibrium and tentative acceptance the Canadian Jews had worked so hard to achieve, living quietly in suburbs alongside the larger Gentile Canadian community? The Canadian Jews had their own history. They were the descendants of parents and grandparents who fled the pogroms in Russia. At the turn of the century, these people arrived on boats only to be greeted by a Canadian society that had restricted neighborhoods, hotels and beaches, quotas for higher education, and outright disdain for the Jewish immigrants and their ways. It took 50 years for those Jews in Canada to respond to this brand of anti-Semitism and build their own parallel institutions, like the Jewish General Hospital, social clubs, the YMHA, and various Jewish community centers. As these early Canadian Jews amassed wealth, many wanted to simply fit in, to look and act like their Gentile neighbors and deflect any negative attention. The presence of the Holocaust survivors must have reminded them of their grandparents and the obstacles they overcame. The Canadian Jews definitely cared about the well-being of the Holocaust survivors and took responsibility to help them, but they didn't always want to socialize or live in the same neighborhoods as the refugees. Perhaps it was too painful, or it was snobbery, or maybe it was a little bit of both. Time is a funny thing, though. Within a generation, the children and grandchildren of the refugees and those of the established Canadian Jews almost immediately became indistinguishable. I know this firsthand. Most of my friends descended from the established Canadian Jewish community. We freely and happily socialized in each other's homes. We went to the same summer camps, high schools, and universities, attended the same parties, dated each other, got married, and built lifelong friendships together. For better or for worse, this pattern repeated itself when the influx of Russian Jews arrived in Canada and the United States in the early 1990s. Okay, so I now want to share these two paintings and focus on my great-grandparents. You have Chaya Leah on the right and Godel Mengel on the left. They were not married to each other. Rather, they were machatonim, in-laws. These two people's stories were almost lost forever because nobody wanted to talk about them. I think I understand why. Immediately after they were murdered, Godel and Chaya Leah's surviving family members had to compartmentalize these horrors and go into survival mode in order to get through the war, save their children and each other. If they didn't, my grandparents would have completely fallen apart and then they all would have perished. But even in Canada, I believe my grandparents needed to stay partially in survival mode in order to keep moving forward with their lives. Telling their parents' stories would cause them to relive the horror all over again. When my sisters and I were born, my parents thought it was way too scary to share their fates with us. They wanted to protect us so we didn't have nightmares. In the end, my great-grandparents were treated as if they didn't exist, but I wanted to know who they were and what happened to them. My mom finally told me. So I'm going to read the story that goes with the painting on the left, which is called A Dignified Background. Here's the story. The first time I learned about my great-grandfather, Godel Mengel, I was in middle school. We had to create a family tree and present an heirloom for a special class project. My family tree was sparse. It included all the names of my grandparents, but only a couple of names from my great-grandparents' generation and nothing else. My parents were children during the Holocaust and knew very little about our past. I asked about Godel, one of the few names on the exotic great-grandparent line. My mother told me that he was taken by the Nazis, but provided no other details. I then asked if we had any family heirlooms, and the answer was no. Everything we had was acquired after the family immigrated to Canada in 1949. At that time, our stuff was around 30 years old, so nothing passed from generation to generation. For a history lover like me, I felt deflated. When it was time to present our trees and heirlooms at school, I worried that my teacher would think that I didn't put any effort into the assignment. I recall a boy in my class, Teddy, proudly wearing his great-grandfather's Indian First Nations headdress. His family had been on the land for thousands of years. I was jealous of Teddy. He had a proud history that he could trace. How ironic. As Teddy spoke, I saw how much the Holocaust had robbed my family. Our names, our records, and our possessions were obliterated. Fast forward to today. Thousands of documents are being uploaded almost daily onto websites dedicated to preserving precious details about who existed when the Shoah started. I searched Godel Mengele. Imagine my surprise when a photo from a Krakow ghetto identity card uploaded onto my monitor. My handsome great-grandfather, looking humiliated, resigned, terrified, brave, and dignified, all in the same moment, was staring at me. He was 66 years old. My mom recognized him immediately, even though she was 5 years old the last time she saw him alive. She finally shared what happened to Godel. His was one of our family's unspeakable stories. Grandfather Godel was taken to one of the camps and was a victim of the Shoah's most sinister of crimes. I heard my mother's words like sound bites. They used him for science experiments, and they injected him with gasoline. It's no wonder she didn't share details about him when I was in middle school. I can barely put words to it now. I suddenly realized that he has no grave and that his story was so close to being relegated to the dustbins of history. I could almost feel his soul lingering in the heavens with no peace. I decided to provide great-grandfather Godel with a small monument to honor his life. As best I could, I created this painting out of a photo that was taken in an act of hatred. My studio took on a sacred quality. I was able to reach across time and space and recreate an image of my great-grandfather's face, but this time with love. Every brushstroke felt important. A powerful moment happened when the music on my iPhone looped to the Leonard Cohen song, You Want It Darker. Just as I felt I had captured Godel's likeness, I heard the haunting words of the chorus singing, Hineni, which means here I am. My eyes filled with tears. The background pattern is from my dining room wallpaper, the room where Godel's great-great-grandchildren come together every week to celebrate Shabbat and continue living our Jewish heritage, the real heirloom that has been passed down from generation to generation. May you find abundant peace from heaven, dear great-grandfather Godel. Well, this is our last slide. It's called the Simcha, or a joyful occasion. So as this presentation winds down, I want to conclude by showing you a painting that I started working on at the beginning of the pandemic. This was my quarantine project, and it's lofty with 31 faces to paint in one image. I wanted to paint this one because this is the group that started in Krakow before the war, survived the Holocaust, and then immigrated to Canada to build a new life. The photo was taken in the 1970s at my cousin Helen's wedding in Montreal, and it was the last time they would all have a photo taken together like that. My grandparents died shortly after that wedding. The people here are Chaya Leah and Godel Mengele's descendants. The woman seated in blue, my great Aunt Scylla, is the little girl who was sitting on Chaya Leah's lap in the last painting. She and her siblings were saved by Oskar Schindler. The boy in the middle is my cousin Jerry. He was named for Godel Mengele. Every single person in this image was touched by the Holocaust. You have our American cousins from New York City who lived with tremendous guilt that they didn't sponsor the family from Krakow when they had the chance. These New York cousins spent the rest of their lives feeling so burdened by Chaya Leah's murder and the suffering of the family. My mother told me that they were quite well-to-do, and every time one of the survivor cousins got married or had a baby, the New York City cousins would send $5,000 gifts. That was, and frankly still is, a lot of money, especially in those days. You have my uncle Shia, who lost his parents and siblings and his entire extended family in the concentration camps. My mother told me he was so protective over his children, and that created a lot of pressure in their household. You have my dad and my Aunt Sylvia, who survived by hiding in a forest for 19 months. And you have my cousins, Mary, Helen, and Lorna, who were born in DP camps in Italy following the war. And you have my older sisters in the front row, all of whom were named for great-grandparents who were systematically and brutally murdered. The reason I wanted to create this painting now, especially during COVID, was because it enabled me to remind myself that dark times do pass. I see all these people who lived through the unthinkable, dressed in their pink and purple dresses, celebrating a good occasion at a simcha, and I remain optimistic that what we are going through now with this pandemic will pass, and we will all come back together again for better days ahead. Okay, so Heather, I'm gonna conclude this share and open it up to questions and conversation with anybody who would like.
Wow. You know, you and I had a long conversation when I originally met you, and I am feeling quite overwhelmed by how the story has emerged and how you found it was important to actually dig into the history and to celebrate and commemorate those that weren't here. It really was very, very special, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
We have a comment from Linda Heckner, who in fact is our educational director at the center. She said, "This is an incredible talk. Such an amazing artist sharing her history in a unique and memorable way. And indeed, it is all of our histories, remarkable, unusual, fascinating, and deeply moving." Thank you, Linda Heckner.
Thank you, Linda.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about having a look at how the histories, the Jewish histories between Canada and America and South Africa, are there similarities? Are there things that aren't? And there are a lot of similarities. There are a huge amount of similarities. You know, I mean, originally coming into South Africa were the Anglicized Jews who came from Germany or from the UK. And when the Greenickers came from Lithuania and certain parts of Europe, obviously the culture was so completely different. As you mentioned, it was speaking in Yiddish and not necessarily in English. It was being supported by family who had come before. And I think that those difficult times that were faced by Jews who either came before the war or who came as refugees were difficult. They all came and had to start all over again. You know, and I think a lot without education, like you spoke about your grandfather. But I think that generation had a resilience. They had a desire to make something of their lives in a new place, which was so foreign and so different, away from people that were really their Ungaras, which is very difficult. So we have a very similar history here, as far as that is concerned. Also, as far as survivors are concerned, there were a number of survivors who came to South Africa and in the beginning didn't talk about the fact that they were survivors, and also kept together in a group because there was an understanding, there was that unspoken understanding of what had happened. And it was only many, many years later that some of the survivors came forward and started telling their stories. And I think that it's because of people like yourself that need to continue carrying the flame. So Debbie Feldman has a question for you. Was Canada more open to accepting Jewish refugees than America was?
I'm no history expert, but the answer is no. In fact, there's a famous quote from our prime minister, which was, "None is too many." In other words, you get it. They didn't want really the refugees to come, and they figured out ways to suddenly everybody was a tailor. And that was the ticket in, was Canada needed tailors. And so the schmata business, as you saw, was a big ticket. And of course there were sponsorship programs, but they didn't really want the refugees. And nobody really did. That's what was so difficult and upsetting as well. How does that compare to South Africa, just as a point of curiosity? Because I'm not well aware of the experience of Holocaust survivors coming to South Africa.
So we did have certain times within our history when, you know, during the war, before the war, during the war, of where there were restrictions that were imposed. One of the restrictions were that if you didn't speak English, you weren't allowed to come into the country. So you have, I think that wherever you go and people are refugees, there's always a problem. There's always, or should we allow the other to come in? And what does the other represent? And what would they take from us by letting them in? So this a similar kind of thing. Well, you know, what did you do? You took on the occupations of what was you were told. You know, if it's a tailor, you need to say you're a tailor. If you're a jewelry maker, you need to be a jewelry maker. So, you know, a lot of people came into South Africa and ended being what they called smosa, which is, you know, being a traveler with wares and used to travel to different parts of the rural and country areas to sell your belongings. But we have another comment from, let me just move this again, from Sunette Briett. Astounding, what a beautiful presentation, what an inspiring legacy. Debbie Feldman said, my father could speak about 6 languages, but was refused entry to South Africa. Debbie, maybe you would like to open your camera and we'll unmute you and you can share your story. Justine, can you open up for Debbie? Justine?
Yes, I'm promoting her to panelists, and if she's comfortable,
okay,
I'll open her camera.
Right, wonderful. Yeah,
Hi.
Hi, Debbie, we see you. Have you got your camera switched on?
No. Switch on now. So it's actually Bonnie speaking now, Debbie's sister. We happen to be using her computer, so her name came up. And when you said you're going to have to talk now, she's passed the computer to me very quickly and said, you better do this. Yeah, so our father had been a partisan fighter in Lithuania. And then tried to get to Palestine, and I think there was reference to people going to Italy, to DP camps and things. So he was there as a displaced person, hoped to get to Palestine from there, and in the end couldn't get there. And then had a sister living in South Africa, so wanted to come here. And he could speak Lithuanian and Russian. He could understand German and read it. He could obviously Hebrew and Yiddish. Italian after the 2 years in Italy, etc. But he didn't speak either English or Afrikaans, and therefore he was refused entry in South Africa. But then ended up in Southern Rhodesia, which ironically was looking for white people essentially. Yeah, which was obviously quite an issue for people in Southern Africa who came here as a result of racial prejudice and persecution, and then became part of the persecuting society as well. So it was quite a complex issue. Thanks.
In reference to the languages, this wasn't necessarily, my father also spoke 4 or 5 languages as well, based on where he came from, and with Ukraine and Russia and Poland and Yiddish and Hebrew. He had a lot of languages. And I read a book recently called The Montreal Shtetl, and it was about the experience of those new refugees. And part of that divide was the Canadian Jews regarded the immigrants as if they knew nothing, that they weren't educated, they didn't have anything to contribute. And the refugees would look at the Canadians and go, I can speak 5 languages. Like, they almost saw the Canadians as ignorant by comparison. Their education wasn't nearly as superior to just the stuff that these people knew on the ground. So there was a little snobbery going on both sides, but this was what I read in the book. I don't know that my father necessarily had these feelings or experiences, but it was what I read in this one book about this community of immigrants who arrived and their feelings toward the Canadian established community.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing. So interesting.
Thank you.
The other thing that is interesting for me is that for a long time, second generation or third generation didn't actually come out and necessarily associate themselves as being survivors of the Holocaust. And I think it's becoming a worldwide phenomenon now that you are having people who are taking on the mantle of an understanding that if we don't start sharing our stories, who is going to be there to share the stories? So I know you were telling me that you are one of 4 siblings.
5.
5 siblings. Okay. Wow. Okay. And you are the only one who has taken on the candle, the lamp?
I listen, everybody is curious and wants to know about it for sure, but it's something in my own nature. You know, I'm the one that likes to dig for stories. I'm the one that likes to, you know, spend, when I can't sleep at night, go on ancestry.com and try and dig up my family story. I'm the historian in a way. It's a natural inclination in me. I have that sort of just desire to know. But like you said about, I didn't really get that I was a second generation, honestly, until I started making these paintings. I felt that my parents' Holocaust story was their story, it was their life, and it had nothing to do with me. But as I, you know, really worked on these paintings and talked to my mom, I would call her every day to ask questions and get the story. Who's this person and what happened to them? I started to see where I fit in history, like where I am in Jewish history, and why we are the way that we are, why our Judaism is more traditional than everybody else's Judaism, why do I think about these things? Heather, I think we had a little giggle about this, but my husband comes from this too, so there was no offense taken, but he'd come home from work and he'd come upstairs to my studio and see what I was working on. He goes, "The Holocaust again?" And I'm like, I can't help it. I keep seeing these connections to my story is so part of history that I shouldn't be here at all, you know? So it's an awakening that, that's only become really conscious in the last few years. And of course, the Holocaust, like Auntie Sylvia passed away a couple months ago. They're leaving this world, whether we like it or not. And if we want this story to continue, then we need to really get acquainted with it. So I've really taken a lot of responsibility for my children's generation, my sister's children, to really make sure that we've got this and we've told it in a way that people will want to learn it, because there can be exhaustion with the story. Like, why do we keep harping on this? Why do we keep telling it? Why is it important? And we want to make sure that, you know, I wanted to make sure that I found a way to tell it so that it's compelling and interesting and relatable. Oh, I lost you.
Sorry.
Yeah,
we have Rob Baum. He said, "Jacqueline, your paintings are a magnificent memorial to our people and our own lost generations. I'm also touched by your comments about the lack of family photographs on the wall. The tall fellow in the back row of Cheder, the small family gatherings. When I came to South Africa, I was amazed to learn that there were still Lithuanian Jews in the world. I grew up in the States without a family to visit at Thanksgiving, and a miserable primary school experience where I was identified as Jewish, but alive. It is true that we were not wanted, and many of our stories have yet to be heard. Thank you for telling yours."
I'm melting. Thank you.
Look, I think it's from Carolyn. It says, "Well done. You have told the story and made connections to people in 2021. And I think that is what is important. That how do we, if you are a 2G or a 3G or a 4G, what tool do you use in order to be able to tell your story? You know, we can all tell stories in lots of different ways. It can either be through books and words, it can be through painting, it could be through dance, it could be through music. And I think we were really blessed to have you. I'm so pleased that my niece introduced me to you. Otherwise, we would have lost this. I just want to thank everybody for joining us. If there are questions, you can always send them in or email them to us tomorrow. Good night. Thank you for being with us. To Justine, thank you for holding the fort from a technical point of view. And thank you so much, Jacqueline, for sharing your precious story. And you really have moved us. Sorry, that's my dog.
Thank you. And thank you for Tammy Levy, everybody here in Highland Park, for putting us together. All the best.